everyone, I'm Sarah, and today I'm sharing one of the most heartbreaking and shocking stories from my own life. This story gets incredibly intense and will change how you think about family, money, and mental health forever. I need to take you back about 2 years ago when I was 28 years old, living in Phoenix, Arizona. I had worked my tail off as a marketing coordinator at a tech startup, saving every penny I could to buy my first investment property. It wasn't much, just a modest 2-bedroom, 1-bathroom house in a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of town. The house was built in the 1970s, had original hardwood floors that creaked when you walked, and a small but charming backyard with an established garden that the previous owner had lovingly maintained for decades. My parents, Linda and Robert, had been going through some serious financial struggles. Dad had taken early retirement at 62 after his construction company downsized during the economic uncertainties, and Mum had never really held down a steady job in her entire adult life. She was 59 and had always found creative reasons why traditional employment wasn't for her. She tried selling makeup through those pyramid schemes, essential oils that promised to cure everything from headaches to heartbreak, and various other multi-level marketing products over the years. But nothing ever stuck for more than a few months before she'd move on to the next get-rich-quick scheme. When I bought the house, they practically begged me to let them rent it. I'll never forget the conversation we had in my tiny apartment kitchen. Mum had tears streaming down her face as she said, "Honey, we're facing eviction from our apartment. The rent there is $800 a month, and we just can't swing it anymore with your father's reduced income. Could we please rent your little house? We'd take such good care of it, I promise. We'd treat it like it was our own." Dad, being the quieter and more practical one of my parents, had pulled me aside later that same evening. His voice was heavy with worry as he said, "Sarah, I know it's a lot to ask, especially when you're just starting out with your career and this investment. But your mother is really struggling emotionally with our financial situation. She feels like such a failure, and I think having a stable, affordable place to live might help her get back on her feet emotionally and maybe even motivate her to find some kind of work. I loved my parents deeply, despite Mom's dramatic tendencies and her lifelong habit of making everything revolve around herself. So, after some back-and-forth negotiations that stretched over several weeks, we finally settled on $425 per month. This amount was exactly what I needed to cover the mortgage, property taxes, and insurance, with absolutely nothing left over. I wasn't making a single cent of profit on the deal, essentially subsidizing their housing completely. The lease agreement was professionally drawn up by my lawyer friend Jake, clearly stating the rental amount, the 1-year term, both parties' responsibilities for maintenance and utilities, and the standard clauses about rent adjustments and property care. For the first 8 months, everything seemed absolutely perfect, like a fairy tale of how family business arrangements should work. Mum would send me photos almost weekly of the flowers she'd planted in the front garden, bright yellow marigolds that reminded her of sunshine, purple petunias that attracted butterflies, and white roses that climbed the small trellis Dad had installed near the front porch. Dad fixed several minor issues around the house that I probably would have had to hire contractors to handle, including a leaky faucet in the bathroom, some loose floorboards in the hallway, and even repainted the entire front porch a cheerful sage green colour that made the whole house look more welcoming. They seemed genuinely happy and stable for the first time in years, and I felt incredibly good about helping them during such a financially difficult period in their lives. But then, last October, I received a notice in my mailbox that would change everything. It was from my homeowner's insurance company, and the envelope had that official, serious look that immediately made my stomach drop. Inside was a notification that due to increased wildfire risks throughout Arizona and a general rise in insurance claims across the state, my homeowner's insurance premium was going up by $60 per month, effective immediately. $60 might not sound like a fortune to some people, but when you're a young professional still paying off substantial student loans, trying to build your career and learning to manage your first investment property, every single dollar matters more than you might think. I spent weeks agonizing over what to do about this insurance increase. I could potentially absorb the cost myself, but that would mean I'd actually be losing $60 every month on the rental arrangement, which didn't seem financially sustainable long term. I could pass the entire increase along to my parents, but that felt harsh given their already tight financial situation. The mature and fair thing to do, I finally decided, was to split the increase right down the middle. So instead of passing along the full $60, I would ask my parents for an additional $30 per month, bringing their rent from $425 to $450, which still kept them well below market rate for a house of that size in that neighborhood. I genuinely thought I was being more than reasonable and fair. I was still essentially subsidizing their housing by hundreds of dollars each month and taking a significant loss on my investment property. I had no idea that this completely reasonable $30 increase would trigger a chain of events so devastating that it would tear my family apart permanently and ultimately land my mother in a psychiatric hospital. Let me tell you about the conversation that changed everything. I decided to have this discussion in person rather than over the phone or through a text message, because I wanted to be respectful and explain the insurance situation face to face like adults handling a business matter. Looking back now, maybe that was my first critical mistake, but I genuinely wanted to show respect for my parents and give them the opportunity to ask questions and understand the situation fully. It was a beautiful, crisp Saturday morning in early November when I drove over to the house. The fall weather in Phoenix was absolutely perfect, with clear blue skies and that comfortable temperature that makes you remember why people moved to Arizona in the first place. Mum was in the front garden, deadheading the last of the season's roses with the kind of careful attention that showed how much pride she took in maintaining the landscaping. Dad was sitting on the front porch in his favourite rocking chair, reading his newspaper and sipping coffee from the ceramic mug I'd given him for Father's Day years earlier. "Hey, Mom, Dad," I called out as I walked up the stone pathway that Dad had meticulously edged with small decorative rocks. "What a gorgeous morning, isn't it?" Mom looked up from her gardening and smiled that warm, genuine smile that I remembered from my childhood. She wiped her hands on her well-worn gardening gloves and said, "Oh, honey, what a wonderful surprise to see you. Come over here and look at these beautiful chrysanthemums I just planted yesterday. Aren't they absolutely gorgeous? I got them on sale at the garden centre, and I think they're going to look stunning all through the fall season." She was in such a genuinely good mood, and the garden really did look absolutely beautiful. The fall flowers were in full, vibrant bloom, and the little stepping stone pathway that Dad had created with such care looked like something straight out of a home and garden magazine. The whole scene was so peaceful and perfect that for a long moment I almost chickened out completely. But I knew I had to address the insurance situation sooner rather than later, because putting off difficult conversations never makes them easier. "Mom, Dad, could we sit down together for just a few minutes? I need to talk to you both about something important regarding the house." I could see Mom's expression change immediately and dramatically. Her warm smile faded instantly, replaced by a look of worry and suspicion, and her shoulders tensed up like she was preparing for bad news. It was amazing how quickly her entire demeanour shifted. "What's wrong, sweetheart? Is someone sick? Did you lose your job at the company? Are you having financial problems?" No, absolutely nothing like that," I quickly assured her, trying to keep my voice calm and reassuring. "Everyone's healthy, my job is secure, and I'm doing fine financially. This is specifically about the house and some changes I need to make to cover increased costs." Dad carefully folded his newspaper and set it aside, giving me his full attention. He looked concerned but completely reasonable, the way he always did when approaching any kind of problem that needed solving. "What kind of changes are we talking about, sweetheart? How can we help?" I took a deep breath and launched into my explanation. "Well, I received a notice from my insurance company that my homeowner's premium is going up significantly due to the increased wildfire risks here in Arizona. Unfortunately, that means I need to adjust the rent slightly to help cover this increase." Dad nodded slowly and thoughtfully, clearly doing the math in his head and trying to understand the full situation. "That makes perfect sense. How much of an increase are we looking at?" "The insurance went up by $60 a month, but I'm only asking you to cover half of that amount. So the rent would go from $425 to $455, which is just $30 more per month. You'd still be paying well below market rate even with this increase." For what felt like an eternity but was probably only about 30 seconds, there was complete silence. Dad continued nodding slowly, clearly processing the information and recognizing that this was a reasonable request. "That seems completely fair to me," he said finally. "We're still getting an incredible deal compared to anywhere else we could possibly rent, and you're being generous by only asking us to cover half the insurance increase." But Mum's reaction was entirely and dramatically different from Dad's measured response. Her face flushed bright red, starting from her neck and spreading upward, and I could see her hands beginning to shake. $30 more every month? Are you absolutely serious right now, Sarah? Mum, I know it's not ideal timing with the holidays coming up, but this isn't really optional. The insurance company isn't giving me a choice about the increase. "Not ideal timing," she interrupted, her voice rising sharply and taking on that shrill quality that I remembered from my teenage years when she'd get upset about my grades or my friends. "We're barely scraping by as it is. How dare you come here and demand more money from us? We're your parents, for crying out loud." I was genuinely taken aback by the intensity and immediacy of her reaction. This wasn't the response I had expected at all. "Mum, please try to understand the situation. I'm not making any profit on this rental arrangement. I'm actually losing money every month by keeping the rent so far below market rate. The insurance increase isn't something I chose or something I can control." "I don't care about your stupid insurance," she shouted, standing up so quickly and forcefully that she knocked over her small gardening stool, sending it clattering across the concrete. "You're being greedy and selfish. $30 might not seem like much to you with your fancy job and your steady income, but it's a lot of money for people like us who are living on a fixed retirement income." Dad immediately tried to intervene and calm the situation down. "Linda, please calm down and let's discuss this reasonably. She's being more than fair with us, and we both know it. Don't you dare take her side against me, Robert." Mum whirled around to face him with such fury that I was genuinely startled. "Our own daughter is trying to squeeze more money out of us like some kind of slumlord, and you're just going to sit there in your chair and let her do it." The conversation was spiraling completely out of control faster than I could have ever imagined possible. "Mum, please, let's just take a deep breath and discuss this calmly, like adults. The lease agreement we all signed does allow for reasonable rent increases, and $30 to cover increased insurance costs is well within those legal bounds." That innocent mention of the lease agreement was apparently the final straw that sent her completely over the edge. "The lease! The lease!" she screamed so loudly that I was certain every neighbour within 3 blocks could hear her. "I don't care what some stupid piece of paper says. This is our home now. We've put our heart and soul into this place for almost a year. We've improved it with our own money and labour. We've made it beautiful and maintained it perfectly. You can't just decide to charge us more money whenever you feel like it because you want extra spending money." "But, Mum, that's exactly how rental agreements work throughout the entire world. Landlords have the right to adjust rent for legitimate cost increases. "No!" she shouted so loudly and violently that I saw our neighbour, Mrs. Patterson, peek out from behind her front curtains with a concerned expression. "I absolutely refuse to pay one more penny. Not $5, not $10, not $30, not a single cent more. You want more money? Get it from someone else who isn't family." Her face was now bright red, and I could actually see veins bulging in her neck and forehead. Dad stood up quickly and tried to put his hand on her shoulder to calm her down, but she shrugged him off so violently that he stumbled backward slightly. "And another thing," she continued, her voice becoming even more shrill and unhinged, "if you think you can just waltz in here and start making demands like you own this place, you've got another think coming. We've been living here for almost a year now. We have established residency. We have legal rights. You can't just evict us because we won't pay your greedy little rent increase." I felt my own anger starting to rise for the first time in this conversation. I had been patient and understanding, but her reaction was becoming completely unreasonable and honestly insulting. "Mum, first of all, please lower your voice because the neighbours can hear every word you're screaming. Second of all, this isn't greed. This is basic property management. I'm asking you to cover half of an insurance increase that I'm legally required to carry." "I don't care what you're legally required to carry," she spat with genuine venom in her voice. "This is our home, and we're not paying more money to live in our own home. We've earned the right to live here." That's when she said something that I will never, ever forget as long as I live. The words seemed to come from some deep, dark place inside her that I had never seen before. Besides, after everything I've done for you over the years, after giving birth to you and raising you and sacrificing my entire life for your happiness and success, you owe me this house. You owe me a place to live rent-free for the rest of my life as payment for being your mother. The sense of entitlement in her voice was absolutely staggering and unlike anything I had ever heard from her before. Dad looked mortified and embarrassed, his face pale with shock. "Linda, you cannot say things like that to our daughter. Sarah doesn't owe us anything beyond normal family love and respect. She's already been incredibly generous by letting us rent this place for so much less than market value." "Shut up, Robert!" she screamed at him with such fury that I was genuinely afraid she might become physically violent. "Just shut your mouth. You're supposed to be my husband. You're supposed to support me and take my side, not hers." I could see tears beginning to form in Dad's eyes, and in their 40 years of marriage, I had never seen him look so hurt and defeated and confused. This whole horrible situation was tearing apart not just my relationship with Mom, but obviously their marriage too. I should have left right then and there. Every instinct in my body was telling me to get out of this situation before it escalated any further. I should have seen the warning signs that were so clear in hindsight, the red face, the shaking hands, the irrational anger, the complete disconnect from reality. But I made the critical mistake of thinking I could somehow reason with her, that I could somehow make her understand that this was simply a straightforward business transaction between a landlord and tenant who happened to be related by blood. "Mom," I said, trying desperately to keep my voice calm and level and reasonable, "I understand that you're upset about the increase, but this is simply how these arrangements work in the real world. The lease agreement that we all signed clearly states the terms and conditions, including provisions for reasonable adjustments." "Stop talking about the damn lease!" she screamed with such force that spittle flew from her mouth, and before I could react or even process what was happening, she lunged toward me like a wild animal. It happened so incredibly fast that I barely had time to understand what was occurring. One moment I was standing peacefully near the porch steps, trying to have a rational conversation, and the next moment Mom was grabbing at my hair with both hands, trying to pull me down to the ground. Her fingernails, which she always kept meticulously manicured, scraped painfully against my scalp as she twisted her fingers through my hair and used it to shake my head back and forth violently. "You ungrateful little bitch!" she snarled. her face just inches from mine, her breath hot against my cheek. "How dare you come to my house and try to extort money from me, like some kind of criminal?" I grabbed her wrists desperately, trying to get her to release my hair, but her grip was surprisingly strong for a 59-year-old woman. "Mom, stop it! You're hurting me! Let go of my hair right now!" But instead of releasing me, she held on even tighter, using my hair as leverage to shake my entire head back and forth like a rag doll. "You think you're so high and mighty with your college degree and your fancy marketing job and your investment property, but you're nothing without us. Nothing. And you will not steal money from your own parents." Dad jumped up from his chair and rushed over as fast as his 62-year-old legs could carry him. "Linda, stop this immediately. Let go of her right now." "Stay out of this, Robert," she yelled, without taking her wild, unfocused eyes off me. "This is between me and our money-hungry daughter who thinks she can treat us like common tenants." I had never been in a physical altercation with anyone in my entire life, let alone with my own mother. The adrenaline coursing through my body made everything feel surreal and dreamlike, as if I was watching this horrible scene happen to someone else instead of living through it myself. My scalp was burning from where she was pulling my hair, and I could feel several strands breaking off in her tightly clenched fists. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only about 30 seconds, I managed to grab both of her hands and pry them away from my hair with enough force that she stumbled backward. Several long strands of my brown hair remained wrapped around her fingers like some kind of grotesque trophy. The moment I broke free from her grip, I stumbled backward toward my car, breathing heavily and trying to process what had just happened. "What is wrong with you?" I gasped, my hand instinctively going to my scalp, where I could feel scratches from her fingernails. "You just physically assaulted me over $30. Mom's eyes were still wild and unfocused, and she looked like she might lunge at me again at any moment. "I'll do whatever it takes to protect my home from greedy landlords, even if that landlord happens to be my own daughter." Dad stepped between us, his face pale and his hands shaking visibly. "Linda, what has gotten into you? This is absolutely insane behavior." "Oh, so now you're calling me insane?" She whirled on him with renewed fury. "Your wife is insane because she won't let your precious daughter steal from us." I was still in shock from the physical attack, but I knew I needed to get out of there immediately before things escalated even further. "I'm leaving right now," I announced, backing toward my car while keeping my eyes on Mom in case she tried to attack me again. "When you're ready to have a rational adult conversation about this situation, you can call me. But I will not tolerate being physically attacked under any circumstances." "Good," Mom shouted after me, her voice carrying across the entire neighborhood. "And don't bother coming back until you're ready to apologize for being a greedy, ungrateful daughter and drop this ridiculous rent increase." As I reached my car with trembling hands, I turned back to see Dad standing on the porch with his head buried in his hands, while Mom continued ranting and gesturing wildly in the background. The contrast between his defeated posture and her manic energy was heartbreaking and terrifying at the same time. I got in my car with hands that were shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. As I drove away, I could see Mom in my rearview mirror, still standing in the front yard, still gesticulating wildly, while Dad tried unsuccessfully to calm her down, and probably apologizing to any neighbors who might have witnessed the whole horrific scene. That night, I couldn't sleep at all. I kept replaying the incident in my mind, trying to understand how a simple conversation about a minor rent increase had turned into a physical assault. I had asked my parents to help cover half of an insurance increase, which amounted to a 7% rent adjustment that was well within legal limits and more than reasonable given the circumstances. In any other landlord-tenant relationship, this would have been handled with a quick phone call or a brief email exchange. But this wasn't just any rental situation. This was family, and family, as I was learning the hard way, could make even the simplest business transactions incredibly complicated and emotionally charged. The next morning Dad called me, and I could hear the exhaustion and defeat in his voice even through the phone. "Sarah, I am so incredibly sorry about what happened yesterday. Your mother's behaviour was completely unacceptable and inexcusable, and I want you to know that I don't support what she did in any way." "Thanks, Dad. I really appreciate you saying that. How is she today? Has she calmed down at all?" He sighed heavily, and I could picture him rubbing his forehead the way he always did when he was stressed. "She's convinced that you're trying to steal from us and that you have no legal right to raise the rent at all. She's been on the phone all morning trying to find a lawyer who will take her case and fight this increase." My heart sank into my stomach. "Dad, you realise that I absolutely do have the legal right to raise the rent for legitimate cost increases like insurance, right? The lease agreement is very clear about this, and Arizona tenant law supports reasonable rent adjustments." "Of course I realise that, sweetheart. I read every word of that lease agreement when we signed it, and I understand exactly what our obligations are as tenants. But your mother isn't thinking clearly right now. She's completely obsessed with the idea that you're trying to cheat us somehow, and no amount of logic or legal facts seem to matter to her." "What about the physical assault? Does she even acknowledge that what she did was wrong?" There was a long, uncomfortable pause before Dad answered. "She claims you attacked her first and that she was just defending herself from your aggression." I was absolutely speechless. I had never laid a hand on my mother in my entire life. She had been the one who lunged at me, who grabbed my hair, who physically assaulted me in front of witnesses. But apparently, in her version of events, I was somehow the aggressor. "Dad, you were standing right there. You saw exactly what happened. She attacked me unprovoked." "I know, sweetheart. I know exactly what happened, and I'll testify to that if necessary. But trying to convince your mother of the actual facts right now seems to be impossible. She's rewritten the entire incident in her mind, and she genuinely believes her distorted version of events." This was the moment when I first began to suspect that Mom's reaction wasn't just about the money, or even about feeling disrespected as a parent. Something much deeper and more serious was going on with her mental state. Something that would soon become much more apparent and much more frightening. 3 days after the incident, I received a certified letter in my mailbox that I had been halfway expecting but still dreaded opening. My hands were actually shaking as I tore open the envelope, even though I wasn't entirely surprised by what I found inside. It was a formal legal notice from the law firm of Henderson and Associates, representing my mother in what they described as a dispute over an illegal and retaliatory rent increase. The letter was 2 full pages of dense legal language written in that intimidating style that lawyers use to make simple situations sound incredibly complex and serious. The basic argument they were making was that I had no legal right to raise their rent because they were family members, that the insurance increase was somehow fabricated or exaggerated, and that I was attempting to unlawfully evict elderly tenants through what they called financial coercion. They were demanding that I immediately rescind the rent increase, pay their legal fees, and provide them with a written guarantee that their rent would never be increased again, or they would take me to court and seek additional damages. I sat at my kitchen table reading and rereading that letter, feeling like I was trapped in some kind of bizarre alternate reality or nightmare. This entire legal mess was over $30 a month, $30 that represented half of a legitimate insurance increase that I was required by law to carry on my property. The amount was so small that it represented less than what most people spend on coffee in a week. Yet here was my own mother hiring lawyers and threatening to take me to court over it. I immediately called my lawyer friend Jake, who had helped me draft the original lease agreement and who knew all the details of the rental arrangement. "Jake, I need your legal advice. My parents are threatening to sue me over a $30 rent increase. What kind of rent increase are we talking about here? He asked, and I could hear him typing notes on his computer. $30 a month to cover half of an insurance increase. I have all the documentation from the insurance company showing the rate hike, and the lease agreement clearly allows for reasonable adjustments. There was a pause while he processed this information. Sarah, I hate to be completely blunt about this, but your parents don't have a legal leg to stand on. Landlords have the absolute right to adjust rent for legitimate cost increases, especially insurance and property taxes. The fact that they're family members doesn't change the fundamental legal dynamics of the landlord-tenant relationship. That's exactly what I thought, but they've hired a lawyer who seems to think they have some kind of valid case. They probably found some attorney who's willing to take their money, even though the case has absolutely no merit whatsoever. Some lawyers will file anything if the client pays their retainer up front, regardless of whether they have any chance of winning. Don't worry about this from a legal standpoint. This should be completely straightforward to defend. But as the weeks went by, I realized that even though I would ultimately win any legal battle, the emotional and financial cost of fighting my own parents in court was absolutely devastating. The legal fees alone were going to cost me thousands of dollars, far more than the disputed rent increase would generate over multiple years. More importantly, the stress of having to defend myself against accusations of elder abuse and illegal eviction was taking a serious toll on my mental health and my ability to focus on work. Mom's lawyer filed a motion for a temporary restraining order claiming that I was harassing my parents and attempting to force them out of their home through intimidation and financial pressure. The hearing for this motion was scheduled for a Thursday morning in late November, and I had to take time off work to appear in court and defend myself against these ridiculous allegations. Walking into that courthouse knowing I was about to face my own mother across a legal battlefield was one of the most surreal and heartbreaking experiences of my entire life. The building was one of those imposing government structures with marble floors and high ceilings that make you feel small and intimidated even when you haven't done anything wrong. Mom sat at the plaintiff's table with her attorney, a middle-aged man in an expensive grey suit who looked like he specialized in creating drama rather than resolving disputes in a reasonable manner. When I walked into the courtroom, Mom didn't even look in my direction. She kept her eyes fixed straight ahead, her jaw set in a hard, determined line that I had never seen before. She was wearing her best dress, a navy blue outfit with white trim that she usually reserved for church services or special family occasions. Her hair had been professionally styled in a way that made her look older and more frail than her actual 59 years. It was clearly a calculated appearance designed to garner sympathy from the judge and make her appear to be a vulnerable elderly victim. Dad wasn't there, which surprised me until I learned later that Mom had specifically forbidden him from attending the hearing. She had told him that he couldn't be trusted not to betray her by supporting me, and that his presence would only complicate her case. The hearing itself was mercifully brief, but absolutely humiliating on a level I had never experienced before. Mum's lawyer painted me as a greedy slumlord who was taking advantage of vulnerable elderly tenants for financial gain. He claimed that the insurance increase was fabricated or exaggerated, and that I was using financial pressure to force my parents out of their home so I could rent it for much more money to strangers. He used phrases like elder abuse and financial exploitation, words that made me feel sick to my stomach when applied to my relationship with my own parents. "Your Honour," he said in a dramatic voice that belonged in a television courtroom drama, "this is a classic case of elder abuse disguised as a legitimate business transaction. The defendant is exploiting her position as landlord to financially abuse her own parents, taking advantage of their vulnerability and their trust in her as their daughter." When it was my turn to speak, Jake presented the insurance documentation showing the exact amount of the increase, the original lease agreement with all its terms, clearly spelled out, and a market analysis showing that my parents were paying well below market rate, even with the proposed increase. Your Honour, this is simply a case of a landlord adjusting rent to cover legitimate cost increases, as clearly allowed under the terms of the lease agreement that both parties signed. The plaintiff's family relationship to the defendant doesn't change the fundamental legal realities of the landlord-tenant relationship they voluntarily entered into. The judge was an older woman who looked like she had seen every possible kind of family dispute during her years on the bench. She listened to both presentations with an expression of barely concealed annoyance and impatience. When the lawyers finished their arguments, she removed her reading glasses and looked directly at Mom's attorney with obvious disapproval. "Counselor, I'm going to save your client some money here and give you some free legal advice. This motion for a restraining order is denied. A $30 rent increase to cover documented insurance costs is completely reasonable and entirely legal. The plaintiff signed a lease agreement that clearly allows for such adjustments, and I see absolutely no evidence of harassment or intimidation. The family relationship between the parties doesn't negate the terms of the contract they both signed voluntarily." She then looked directly at my mother with a stern expression that would have made me shrink into my chair if I had been on the receiving end of it. "Mom, I understand that family disputes can be emotionally charged and painful, but this courtroom is not the appropriate place to resolve personal grievances or family conflicts. If you don't want to pay the rent increase, you have the option to move to different housing. If you do want to continue living in the property, you need to pay the amount specified in your lease agreement. Those are your only two options under the law." I felt a complicated mixture of relief and profound sadness as we left the courthouse. I had won the legal battle, but it felt like a completely hollow victory. My own mother had just tried to paint me as an elder abuser in front of a judge in a courtroom full of strangers. The public humiliation of defending myself against such accusations was almost worse than the financial stress and legal expenses. As we walked toward the parking lot, Mum finally made direct eye contact with me for the first time since the whole ordeal had begun. But instead of the shame or recognition that I had hoped to see in her eyes, they were filled with cold, hard rage that seemed to burn right through me. "This isn't over," she said quietly, but with such intensity that her words sent a chill down my spine. "You may have fooled that judge with your fake documents and your smooth-talking lawyer, but I know what you're really doing here, and I'm not going to let you get away with stealing from us. I honestly thought that losing in court would bring Mom back to reality. I genuinely believed that having a judge explain the legal facts to her in clear, simple terms would help her understand that her position was completely untenable and that we could finally move past this whole nightmare situation and get back to being a normal family. I was completely wrong. If anything, the court defeat seemed to fuel her anger and paranoia even more than before. The first sign that things were actually getting worse rather than better came just 2 days after the hearing. Dad called me at work, and I could hear the complete exhaustion and defeat in his voice, even through the phone. "Sarah, I need to warn you about something. Your mother is seriously talking about filing for divorce." "Divorce over this rent situation? She says I betrayed her by not supporting her in court, even though she wouldn't let me attend the hearing. She's convinced that you and I have somehow conspired against her. Last night she told me that after 40 years of marriage, she's finally seeing my true colours and realising that I've never really loved her. My heart absolutely broke for my father. He had done absolutely nothing wrong except try to be reasonable and logical in a completely unreasonable situation. Dad, I'm so sorry this is affecting your marriage. I never wanted any of this to come between you and Mom. It's not your fault, sweetheart. None of this is your fault. Your mother is just not herself right now. I don't know how else to explain what's happening to her. She's completely obsessed with this rent situation and the court case. She talks about it constantly from the moment she wakes up until she goes to bed at night. She's convinced that you're part of some kind of elaborate conspiracy to steal from her. What kind of conspiracy? That doesn't make any sense at all. I wish I could explain her theories to you, but they honestly don't make any logical sense. She thinks you're working with the insurance company to fabricate the rate increase. She thinks the judge was somehow bribed to rule against her. She even thinks I'm secretly receiving money from you to support what she calls your scheme to steal her home. This was the moment when I truly began to realize that Mom's response to the situation wasn't just stubborn or unreasonable. It wasn't even just about feeling disrespected or taken advantage of. This was potentially a sign of something much more serious happening with her mental health. Healthy, rational people don't construct elaborate conspiracy theories involving multiple parties over a $30 rent increase. A few days later, the situation escalated in a way that genuinely frightened me. I came home from work to find 17 missed calls on my phone, all from Mom's number. When I listened to the voicemails, they started out angry but became increasingly unhinged and threatening as they progressed. The first one was relatively controlled. "Sarah, it's your mother. I know exactly what you're trying to do to us, and I want you to know it's not going to work. Call me back immediately so we can discuss this situation." By the fifth voicemail, her voice was getting louder and more aggressive. "Sarah, I told you to call me back. Don't think you can just ignore me after everything you've put us through. I am your mother, and I deserve respect." The 10th voicemail was when she really started screaming, "You backstabbing little snake! I brought you into this world, and I can take you out of it. You think you're so smart with your lawyers and your fake insurance papers, but I'm much smarter than you think I am." The final voicemail was the most disturbing and threatening of all. "I'm not going anywhere, Sarah. This is my house now, and you can't make me leave. I don't care what any judge says. I don't care what any piece of paper says. This is my home, and if you try to take it away from me, you're going to regret it for the rest of your miserable life." I saved all of the voicemails and immediately forwarded them to Jake for his legal opinion. "These sound like genuine threats," he said when he called me back that evening. "You might want to seriously consider filing for a restraining order against your own mother." But I couldn't bring myself to take formal legal action against Mom, despite her increasingly erratic and threatening behavior. She was still my mother, regardless of what she was going through, and some part of me continued to hope that she would eventually come to her senses and we could somehow repair our relationship. That hope was completely shattered 2 weeks later when I received a call from Mrs. Patterson, the elderly woman who lived in the house next door to my rental property. "Sarah, dear, I think you should know that something very concerning happened over at your parents' place this morning." "What do you mean? What happened?" "Well, I was working in my garden around 9 o'clock when I heard your mother screaming and throwing things around in the backyard. When I looked over the fence to see what was happening, I saw her ripping up all the beautiful flowers in the garden and throwing clay pots around like she was having some kind of breakdown. She was crying and yelling about how no one was going to take her home away from her. My stomach dropped and I felt physically sick. How long ago did this happen?" "About an hour ago. Your father tried his best to stop her, but she started yelling at him too and calling him terrible names. I think she might have actually thrown one of those heavy flower pots at him, but I couldn't see everything clearly from my yard." I thanked Mrs. Patterson and immediately drove over to the house, my heart pounding the entire way. What I found when I arrived was absolutely devastating and heartbreaking. The beautiful garden that Mom had been so proud of just a few weeks earlier, the garden she had lovingly tended and photographed and shown off to anyone who would listen, was completely destroyed. Bright yellow marigolds were scattered across the brown lawn. Purple petunias were torn from their roots and trampled into the dirt, and the white roses that had been climbing the trellis were ripped down and lying in broken pieces. Clay pots were smashed against the wooden fence, and the small decorative bird bath that Dad had installed with such care was overturned and cracked down the middle, I found Dad sitting on the back steps with his head buried in his hands, looking older and more defeated than I had ever seen him. When he looked up at me, I could see that he had a small but visible cut on his left cheek, and his shirt was dirty like he had been pushed or had fallen down. "Dad, are you okay? What happened to your face?" He touched the cut on his cheek self-consciously, as if he had forgotten it was there. "Your mother threw a ceramic pot when I tried to stop her from destroying the garden, and a piece of it hit me when it shattered against the fence. I don't think she meant to hurt me directly. She was just so angry and out of control that she wasn't thinking about where she was throwing things. Where is she right now? Inside the house, on the phone with yet another lawyer. She's convinced that destroying the garden was somehow a legitimate form of protest against the rent increase, like some kind of civil disobedience." I looked around at the complete destruction, trying to process what I was seeing and understand how we had gotten to this point. This wasn't normal anger or frustration over a difficult situation. This wasn't even an extreme emotional reaction to feeling taken advantage of. This was something else entirely, something that suggested Mom was genuinely losing touch with reality and her own sense of right and wrong. "Dad, I really think Mom needs professional help. This kind of behaviour isn't rational or normal." He nodded sadly, and I could see tears forming in his eyes. "I've been thinking the same thing for weeks now, but she absolutely won't listen to me or consider getting help. She says that everyone is against her and that I'm the only person she should be able to trust, but then she turns around and accuses me of betraying her whenever I don't agree with everything she says and does." That evening, after spending hours helping Dad clean up the worst of the damage in the backyard, I made one of the most difficult decisions of my entire life. I called Jake and asked him to begin formal eviction proceedings against my parents. I simply couldn't continue to subsidize Mum's increasingly destructive and dangerous behavior, and I couldn't allow her to continue destroying my property or threatening my safety and Dad's safety. "Are you absolutely certain about this?" Jake asked me. "Once we file the eviction paperwork, there's no going back. This will become a matter of public record, and it will permanently damage your relationship with your parents." I looked at the photos I had taken of the destroyed garden, the broken pots, and the cut on Dad's face, and I knew I didn't have any other choice. My relationship with my mother is already completely destroyed, and if I don't take action now, I'm afraid she's going to hurt someone or do something even worse than destroy the garden. The eviction notice was served 3 days later by a professional process server, as required by Arizona law. According to state statutes, my parents had 30 days to either pay all outstanding rent and fees or vacate the property voluntarily. I knew Dad would want to comply with the legal order, but I had absolutely no idea how Mom might react to being formally evicted. I didn't have to wait very long to find out. The morning after the eviction notice was delivered, I woke up to a phone call from my apartment building's management office. "Ms. Sarah, this is David from the front office. You need to come down here immediately. Someone has vandalized the front of the building, and it appears to be directed specifically at you." When I got downstairs and walked outside, I was absolutely horrified by what I saw. Someone had spray-painted "thief" and "elder abuser" across the front entrance of my apartment building in bright red paint, using letters that were at least 3 feet high and visible from the street. Underneath those words, in slightly smaller letters, was painted, "Sarah the slumlord steals from her own parents." I knew immediately who was responsible for the vandalism, but I couldn't prove it legally. When I called the police to report the incident, they took a formal report and photographed the graffiti, but they told me that without witnesses or security camera footage showing the actual vandalism taking place, there wasn't much they could do to pursue charges. The apartment management was understandably upset about the damage to their property and informed me that I would be responsible for the cost of removing the graffiti and repainting the entire front entrance. The estimate they received was over $800, far more than the disputed rent increase would have generated in an entire year. That afternoon, Mum called me for the first time since the court hearing, and her voice had an eerie, unnaturally calm quality that somehow made the conversation even more unsettling than her previous screaming voicemails. "Hello, Sarah. I see you've decided to try to evict us from our home. Mum, it's not your home. It's my house that you've been renting, and after the property damage and the threats, I can't continue the rental arrangement." "Property damage? What property damage are you talking about? I was simply doing some gardening work on my own property." The complete disconnect from reality in her voice was absolutely chilling. She genuinely seemed to believe that destroying the entire garden and throwing pots at Dad constituted normal gardening activities. "Mom, you also spray-painted graffiti on my apartment building last night. That's vandalism, and it's illegal." "I have absolutely no idea what you're talking about," she said, with that same unnaturally calm tone. "But I will say this. If people in your neighborhood are starting to realize what kind of person you really are, maybe that's just karma coming back to get you for the way you've treated your own family." I hung up the phone feeling more frightened than angry. This woman who had raised me, who had taught me the difference between right and wrong, who had been my mother for 28 years, was becoming someone I didn't recognize at all, and I had no idea how far she might be willing to go to protect what she now considered to be her property. The final straw came exactly 1 week before the eviction deadline. I was at work when my phone rang with a call from the Phoenix Fire Department. "Ma'am, we're currently at 1247 Maple Street responding to a fire alarm activation. Are you the property owner?" My blood turned to ice in my veins. "Yes, that's my rental property. Is there a fire? Is everyone okay? What's happening?" "Well, that's the strange part of this situation. There's no actual fire, but someone appears to have deliberately set off multiple smoke bombs inside the house. The entire place is filled with thick smoke, but there's no fire damage that we can detect. Do you know anything about this incident?" When I arrived at the house 30 minutes later, the entire street was filled with fire trucks, police cars, and an ambulance. The scene looked like something from a disaster movie, with emergency responders everywhere and neighbours standing in their yards trying to figure out what was happening. Mum was standing in the front yard wearing her bathrobe and slippers, crying dramatically and telling anyone who would listen that I had somehow booby-trapped the house to try to hurt them. "Officer, my daughter is trying to kill us," she sobbed to a police sergeant, grabbing his arm and pointing at me as I approached. "She set off smoke bombs in our home to try to make us leave. She's trying to murder her own parents." Dad was sitting in the back of the ambulance, being examined by paramedics for possible smoke inhalation. When he saw me approaching, he looked absolutely defeated and embarrassed. "Sarah, I'm so incredibly sorry. She set off the smoke bombs herself and then called 911, claiming that you had somehow triggered them remotely." The fire chief, a no-nonsense woman in her 50s, who had obviously seen every kind of emergency situation imaginable, pulled me aside for a private conversation. "Ms. Johnson, I need to ask you directly, and I need a completely honest answer. Did you have anything whatsoever to do with these smoke bombs?" "Absolutely not," I said immediately. "I was at my office downtown when this happened. I have security camera footage and electronic keycard records that can prove I was nowhere near this house today." She nodded with the confident expression of someone who had already figured out the truth. "That's exactly what I expected you to say. We found the smoke bomb packaging in the kitchen trash can, and there's no possible way they could have been activated remotely. Someone inside the house had to light them manually with matches or a lighter." "What happens now? Is anyone in trouble for this?" "Well, we can't definitively prove who activated the smoke bombs, but given the circumstances and the fact that there's an active eviction proceeding, I would strongly recommend that you expedite the process of getting these tenants out of your property as quickly as possible. This situation is clearly escalating beyond normal landlord-tenant disputes, and someone could end up getting seriously hurt." As I drove home that evening, I realized that my mother had reached a point where she was willing to endanger herself, my father, and all the neighbours just to create a dramatic scene that she somehow thought would support her delusional narrative that I was the villain in this situation. This wasn't about $30 anymore. This wasn't even about the house or the eviction. This was about a woman who had completely lost her grip on reality and was spiralling into what was clearly a serious mental health crisis that was putting everyone around her at genuine risk. The next morning, I made the phone call that I had been dreading for weeks. I contacted the county's Adult Protective Services to report that my mother appeared to be experiencing a severe mental health emergency and might pose a danger to herself and others. It was the most difficult phone call I had ever made in my entire life. But I knew it was absolutely the right thing to do. Mom desperately needed professional help that I couldn't provide, and Dad needed protection from her increasingly erratic and dangerous behaviour. What I didn't know at the time was that this call would set in motion a series of events that would ultimately lead to one of the most heartbreaking outcomes I could have ever imagined. The Adult Protective Services investigation took almost 2 weeks, during which time Mom's behaviour became even more unpredictable and concerning. She began calling me at all hours of the day and night, sometimes crying and begging me to drop the eviction, other times screaming threats and accusations. She started showing up at my apartment building at random times, pounding on the front door and demanding to be let in so she could explain the truth to my neighbours. Dad called me almost every day during this period, and he sounded more exhausted and defeated with each conversation. "She's not sleeping, Sarah. She stays up all night pacing around the house and talking to herself about conspiracies and legal strategies. During the day she makes phone call after phone call to lawyers, but none of them will take her case because she can't pay their fees, and her claims don't make legal sense. Dad, you don't have to stay there if you feel unsafe. You can stay with me or we can get you a hotel room. I can't leave her alone right now. I'm honestly afraid of what she might do to herself or to the house if I'm not here to watch her." The breaking point came on a Tuesday evening when I received a call from the police. "Mom, we've arrested your mother for criminal trespassing. She was found on your rental property at approximately 11 p.m., looking through windows and attempting to gain entry through a back window." I wasn't surprised when I got the call, but I was deeply saddened. Her anger and obsession had driven her to the point where she was willing to break the law just to maintain some kind of connection to the house she had convinced herself belonged to her. "Is she okay? What happens now?" "She's been taken to the county jail for booking, but given her age and the non-violent nature of the offence, she'll probably be released in the morning. However, I should warn you that her behaviour during the arrest was quite erratic. She claimed that she was being persecuted for trying to protect her property from theft." Dad picked her up from jail the next morning and he called me immediately afterward. "Sarah, I think your mother needs to be hospitalised. She's talking about the jail guards being part of the conspiracy against her, and she's convinced that the police are being paid by you to harass her. What did the Adult Protective Services investigators say when you talked to them?" "They're recommending a psychiatric evaluation, but they can't force her to go voluntarily. They said the only way to get her involuntarily committed is if she becomes an immediate danger to herself or others. Unfortunately, we didn't have to wait long for that threshold to be crossed." 3 days after the trespassing arrest, I got another call from a neighbour. This time it was Mr. Rodriguez, who lived across the street from my rental house. "Sarah, I think you need to know that your mother is back at the house and she's destroying the property again. She broke in through the back door sometime during the night and she's been throwing furniture out the windows and screaming at anyone who walks by. When I arrived at the scene, accompanied by 2 police officers I had called for safety, I found Mom in the backyard surrounded by broken furniture, torn clothing, and household items scattered everywhere. She had apparently spent hours systematically destroying everything inside the house and throwing it all out the back door. When she saw me approaching with the police officers, she started screaming, "There she is! There's the thief who stole my home! Arrest her! She's the criminal, not me!" The senior police officer, a veteran who had obviously dealt with mental health emergencies before, approached her carefully. "Ma'am, you need to calm down and come with us. You're on someone else's property without permission, and you've caused significant damage." "This is my property!" she screamed, picking up a broken chair leg and waving it around. "She stole it from me. I have every right to be here." It took 3 officers to safely restrain her and get her into the police car, during which time she continued screaming about conspiracies and theft. As they drove away, I stood in the backyard looking at thousands of dollars worth of damage and realized that my mother had crossed the line from being mentally ill to being genuinely dangerous. This time the judge ordered a mandatory psychiatric evaluation before setting bail. Mum was transported directly from the jail to the county psychiatric hospital, where she would remain for at least 72 hours while doctors assessed her mental state. I didn't visit her during those first 3 days. I knew I needed time to process everything that had happened, and I honestly wasn't sure I could handle seeing her in a psychiatric ward after everything she had put us through. Dad visited her every day, and his reports were heartbreaking. "She doesn't understand why she's there, Sarah. She thinks the doctors are part of the conspiracy too. She keeps asking when she can go home to her house." After a week of evaluation, the doctors diagnosed Mum with a severe bipolar episode combined with early-stage dementia that had apparently been developing slowly for months or possibly years. The stress of the eviction situation had triggered an acute psychiatric crisis that manifested as paranoia, delusions, and increasingly dangerous behaviour. "The good news," Dad told me after meeting with her psychiatrist, "is that with proper medication and treatment, she could potentially stabilise. The bad news is that she'll need to be in a residential facility for several months, possibly longer." The legal case against her for property destruction was eventually dropped after the psychiatric evaluation, with the understanding that she would remain in treatment and stay away from my property. The eviction proceeded as planned, and Dad moved into a small apartment near the hospital so he could visit her regularly. As I'm recording this story today, it's been 8 months since Mum was admitted to the psychiatric facility. She's made some progress with medication, and there are days when she recognises that her behaviour was wrong, though she still doesn't fully understand why she reacted the way she did. Other days, she still believes that I somehow stole her house, and that everyone conspired against her. Dad visits her twice a week and says that she asks about me sometimes, wondering if I'll ever come to see her. I'm not ready yet. The trauma of being physically attacked, legally threatened, and emotionally abused by my own mother is something I'm still working through with my own therapist. The house has been completely renovated and is now rented to a young family who pays $650 per month, which is actually below market rate for similar properties in the neighbourhood. I use the additional income to help pay for Dad's living expenses and to contribute to Mom's medical bills, which insurance doesn't fully cover. Dad and I have grown much closer through this ordeal, bonded by our shared trauma and our mutual commitment to getting Mom the help she needs. He tells me he doesn't blame me for what happened, but I know he wishes things could have been different. We both do. Looking back, I can see warning signs that I missed or dismissed at the time. Mom had always been dramatic and self-centered, but there were subtle changes in her behaviour over the months leading up to the crisis that I attributed to financial stress rather than mental illness. Her increasing paranoia about money, her tendency to rewrite history to support her version of events, and her growing inability to accept responsibility for her actions were all early indicators that something more serious was happening. I've learned some incredibly hard lessons through this experience about family relationships, financial boundaries, and mental health. I've learned that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is to enforce firm boundaries, even when they hate you for it, and even when it feels like you're abandoning them. I've learned that untreated mental illness can transform the people you love most into people you don't recognize, and that getting them help sometimes requires making incredibly difficult decisions that feel like betrayal. Most importantly, I've learned that family disputes about money often aren't really about the money at all. They're about power, control, respect, and deeper psychological issues that may have been brewing for years before they finally explode into crisis. If you're dealing with a family member who seems to be losing touch with reality, please don't wait as long as I did to seek professional help and guidance. The warning signs were there, but I was so focused on trying to manage the immediate crisis and preserve our relationship that I missed the bigger picture of her declining mental health. Early intervention might have prevented some of the trauma and damage we all experienced. And if you're a young person dealing with family members who feel entitled to your financial resources simply because you're related, remember that love and family loyalty don't require you to accept abuse, destruction of your property, or threats to your safety. Setting boundaries with family members can be one of the most difficult things you'll ever have to do, but sometimes it's absolutely necessary for everyone's well-being. The $30 that started this whole nightmare represents so much more than just money. It represents the moment when I had to choose between enabling my mother's unrealistic expectations and taking care of my own financial responsibilities. It represents the point where family loyalty collided with basic business principles and legal obligations. And ultimately, it represents the catalyst that revealed a serious mental health crisis that might have remained hidden for much longer if I hadn't stood firm on a reasonable boundary. I still think about that conversation in the garden sometimes, wondering if there was anything I could have said or done differently that might have prevented the escalation. But my therapist reminds me that I'm not responsible for my mother's mental illness or for her choices about how to respond to disappointment and stress. I can only control my own actions and decisions, and I believe I did the best I could with the information and resources I had at the time. The house itself has become a place of peace again. The new tenants have created a beautiful garden in the backyard, different from what Mom had planted, but equally lovely in its own way. Sometimes when I drive by to check on the property, I remember the good times we had there before everything fell apart. Mum teaching me to plant marigolds when I was little, Dad and I painting the porch together, family barbecues in the backyard before the world turned upside down. Those memories hurt now, but they also remind me that the woman who raised me with love is still in there somewhere, underneath the mental illness and the medications and the institutional care. Maybe someday, when she's stable and I've healed from the trauma, we'll be able to have a relationship again. It won't be the same relationship we had before, but maybe it can be something new and honest and healthy. For now, though, I'm focusing on rebuilding my own life and supporting my father as he navigates the complex emotions of loving someone whose mind is no longer reliable. We're both learning to grieve for the person Mom used to be while still holding hope for who she might become with proper treatment and time. This experience has changed my perspective on so many things. I'm more careful about mixing family relationships with business arrangements. I'm more aware of mental health warning signs in myself and others. I'm more appreciative of the stability and peace that comes from having clear boundaries and honest communication. But most of all, I've learned that sometimes life can spiral completely out of control over the smallest things, and that the strength to handle a crisis often comes from places you never expected. 6 months ago, I never would have imagined I had the courage to have my own mother arrested or to stand firm against her threats and manipulation. But when someone you love becomes dangerous to themselves and others, love sometimes requires you to make choices that feel impossible. If you've listened to this whole story, thank you for taking this journey with me. I hope it helps someone out there who might be going through something similar. Mental illness is devastating not just for the person experiencing it, but for everyone who loves them. And sometimes the most difficult family situations teach us the most important lessons about our own strength, our own boundaries, and our own capacity for both love and self-protection. Remember that seeking help isn't giving up on someone you love. Sometimes it's the most loving thing you can possibly do. Take care of yourselves and remember that you're not alone in dealing with difficult family situations. There are resources and people who can help, even when everything feels hopeless. This has been my story about how a $30 rent increase destroyed my family and changed my life forever. I hope sharing it helps someone else navigate their own impossible choices with a little more wisdom and a little less pain than I experienced. Thank you for listening.